Putin doesn't seem like the kind of guy who gets shaken up easily, but a tactic being used by the Ukrainian army seems to have caught him totally by surprise. But what is this new tactic that some commentators have dubbed Thunder Runs? Did Ukraine invent an entirely new style of warfare? Here's why Ukraine's new tactics are so effective and why the Russian army is no longer dreaming of victory, but how to survive. After months of grinding warfare, in early September, Ukrainian forces launched an offensive operation in two places at once. Once toward Kherson in the south, the other directed at the Kharkiv Oblast in the northeast. The counterattack quickly shattered the Russian perimeter around Kharkiv, liberating the city, its strategic rail hubs, and dozens of adjacent villages that for months had been under Russian occupation. This sudden advance surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. When it started, few believed the operation could achieve more than small territorial gains. But when it ended, Ukraine had not only inflicted a massive psychological blow against its enemy, it had also liberated several thousand kilometers of territory, captured huge numbers of prisoners and equipment, severed vital lines of support, and sent Russian forces fleeing in panic. They were so desperate to escape, Ukrainian residents even reported cases of Russian soldiers putting on civilian clothes and trying to flee on stolen bicycles. Did this mark a turning point in the war? As the conflict drags on, it's hard to say, but while the counteroffensive's broader impact remains unknown, few can doubt the tactical prowess of the Ukrainian forces that was on full display. So what made such incredible advances possible? In order to understand the devastating tactics at the heart of Ukraine's recent success, first we need to look at the concept of maneuver warfare. Tactical mobility has been a pillar of effective warfare for thousands of years. The concept of maneuver warfare relies on a combination of initiative, deception, speed, and disruption to exploit enemy weaknesses. It is basically the opposite of attritional warfare, where one army tries to outlast the other over a long period of time. Rather than solely focusing on engaging and destroying enemy forces in the field, maneuver warfare seeks to isolate, strangle, and sever the support structures that sustain them with a small number of decisive actions. This often means avoiding forward strongpoints altogether, instead probing areas of weakness and striking the enemy where they least expect it. These surprising breakthroughs sow chaos and confusion and can, under the right circumstances, erode the enemy's will to fight altogether. History is filled with examples of effective maneuver warfare. It's perhaps best epitomized in history by the highly mobile horsemen of the Eurasian steppes, Hannibal's forces at Cannae, and Napoleon's legendary combinations of cavalry and fast-marching infantry who dominated European armies with deception and speed. Modern commanders continue to preach battlefield mobility as a non-negotiable tenet of successful warfighting. Of course, the industrialization of warfare in the mid-19th and early 20th centuries changed everything. The introduction of trains, trucks, and tanks to the battlefield made it possible for armies to achieve massive breakthroughs by concentrating mobile mechanized formations at weak points along enemy lines. Perhaps nothing has embodied this doctrinal evolution more than the images of German panzers rolling across the Low Countries in the early 1940s. The German Blitzkrieg certainly embodied maneuver warfare at its finest, incorporating innovative technologies and tactics to achieve notable early successes during World War II. But while many have drawn parallels between German Blitzkrieg tactics and the recent offensive in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have applied the concept of maneuver warfare on a far narrower scale. Rather than closely coordinating air and mechanized ground assets to destroy enemy forces on a broader operational level, like the German Lightning War sought to achieve, the Ukrainians have employed what some commentators have labeled thunder runs to shift the strategic initiative into their favor. So what exactly is a thunder run? Sometimes called a light strike, reconnaissance in force, or reconnaissance by fire, thunder runs call for high-speed, heavily armored military convoys to plunge deep into enemy territory, bypassing unimportant cities and defensive strongpoints in a bid to get behind and destabilize the enemy's rear. Provoking fire, identifying vulnerabilities, moving on and doubling back where necessary, thunder runs create an illusion of overwhelming force that unleashes a debilitating psychological impact on those who encounter them. When it works, the results are spectacular. As lightweight armored vehicles, like civilian 4x4s, pickup trucks, and Western-donated Humvees in the case of Ukraine, sporadically engage the enemy, they direct onrushing infantry and armor behind them to areas that they can do the most damage. Using this tactic, Ukraine's Thunder Run quickly overwhelmed demoralized Russian defenders in the Kharkiv Oblast, isolating them from their parent units in such a way as to render entire Russian formations disorganized and combat ineffective. A Thunder Run's success hinges on a series of contingent overlapping factors. First, the weather must be good, at least good enough for off-road vehicles to travel quickly. Second, there must be a promising window of opportunity, one in which the enemy suffers from faulty intelligence, low morale, poor command and control, or exposed logistical lines. Third, the onrushing forces must avoid overreach, meticulously planning each phase of the advance while establishing safe and secure lines of support. And fourth, they must achieve surprise, fulfilling Sun Tzu's 5th century injunction to bait your enemy into predictable patterns of response, occupying their minds while you wait for the extraordinary moment, that which they cannot anticipate. The recent Ukrainian offensive checked all the boxes. It occurred at the tail end of a long, hot summer. It was preceded by a convincing deception campaign that drew many of Russia's most experienced units south, leaving the 1,000-kilometer Kharkiv front exposed and vulnerable for months. High-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, eviscerated Russian ammo and supply depots, command posts, and other targets deep behind enemy lines, causing Russian morale to plunge. On top of that, Ukrainian logistics were sound, their intelligence was accurate, and their armor and infantry were well-drilled and prepared to operate in harmony. It was the perfect storm, one the Ukrainians exploited magnificently. The sheer speed of Ukraine's advance generated new opportunities, including the liberation of strategic transport hubs at Kupiansk and Izium, and the shifting of the strategic initiative into Ukrainian hands for the first time, capping what is undeniably the most significant Ukrainian victory since the Battle of Kyiv back in April, and arguably the worst Russian defeat since the bloody days of World War II. But the offensive was far from the only case where daring mechanized thrusts deep into enemy territory yielded incredible results. During World War II, small groups of plucky special operators drawn from the corners of the British Empire formed the core of the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG, a unit whose actions prefigured the modern Thunder Run with their focus on strategic reconnaissance, infiltration, raiding, and sabotaging behind enemy lines. Commandeering specially equipped light trucks and jeeps, the LRDG plied their trade in the vast desert sands of North Africa. They spent long days patrolling, probing, and penetrating enemy positions. Stripping heavy windscreens, doors, and hoods to save weight, desert operators outfitted their vehicles with a bristling array of machine guns, cannons, grenades, and explosives for any conceivable situation. They exuded individuality and initiative. Most would have felt right at home with modern Ukrainian soldiers firing RPGs from the back of haphazardly armored Toyota 4x4s, lurching forward in great bounds towards the Russian frontier. There are many other historical parallels from World War II, none more apt than Patton's armored breakthroughs in France and Germany that were only limited by their inability to keep vehicles fueled, a powerful reminder of the importance of logistics, munition, fuel, and food to sustain such rapid advances. Fast-forwarding a few decades, it was the Vietnam War where the term Thunder Run actually originated. There, American mechanized units devised an ingenious way to bypass pesky minefields. Ironically, by assigning heavily armored M48 Patton tanks to plow forward and simply trigger the mines, rather than spend time and energy clearing them individually. Though the Thunder Run's mine-clearing tactic was inherently dangerous, it prevented operations from bogging down and created the conditions for a deadly ambush. It was only 2 decades ago, during the American invasion of Iraq, that the term evolved to encompass the raid-like qualities we now associate it with. Employed in Iraq to devastating effect, the high-speed American convoy attack into the heart of Baghdad in the spring of 2003 serves as the most obvious point of reference to the recent Ukrainian offensive. When the American military embarked on Operation Iraqi Freedom, they knew toppling Saddam Hussein's regime in Baghdad would pose serious challenges. Operating in a highly urbanized environment, military planners sought to apply the lessons of Operation Desert Storm, hoping the speed, surprise, shock, and awe might paralyze Iraqi defenders and prevent widespread damage to local infrastructure, thus eliminating the possibility for operations to devolve into a costly street-by-street affair in a city of 5 million inhabitants. This choice was, in part, conditioned by recent developments. Just a decade earlier, an ill-fated attempt to rescue the survivors of 2 Black Hawk crashes in the crowded streets of urban Mogadishu resulted in the tragic losses of dozens of American servicemen, and an intense public backlash increased the military's awareness of such urban operations. 2 years later, during the First Chechen War in 1995, Russian armored forces launched an all-out assault on Grozny. The Chechens aggressively resisted, and the outcome was disastrous for the Russians. One Russian motorized brigade lost 3/4 of its main battle tanks and 85% of its armored vehicles. It was a botched Thunder Run if one ever existed, one that seemed to confirm lessons learned the hard way by the Black Hawk crew in Somalia. American military planners hoped to avoid a similar outcome in Iraq, equipping a column of M1A1 Abrams tanks and fast-moving M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Elements of the US 3rd Infantry Division charged headlong into Baghdad, blasting their way through improvised enemy defenses on the way to Saddam's palace. The maneuver created the conditions for a legendary tactical victory, and the subsequent fall of Baghdad owed much to the boldness of subsequent Thunder Runs. But tactical genius doesn't always translate into overall strategic success. The bitter insurgency that emerged in the wake of the 2003 invasion serves as a reminder that military campaigns often have a way of defying expectations, something the Ukrainians will bear in mind as they consolidate their gains and plan future offensives. While it's tempting to argue that Ukraine should continue staging thunder runs to exploit their newfound gains, self-awareness and moderation are key. More often than not, ill-planned thunder runs can go terribly awry. None know this better than the Russians themselves, who followed up their catastrophic failure in Grozny by mounting an uncoordinated armored blitz on Kyiv earlier this year that quickly morphed into an untenable operational situation and an unmitigated strategic disaster. Benefiting from intelligence gained from captured prisoners, tactical flexibility earned by salvaging and repurposing hundreds of captured Russian vehicles, and increased firepower from vast stores of captured ammunition, Ukrainian forces will continue to reap the rewards of their daring operation. Whether it indeed was the turning point many have longed for, we'll just have to wait and see.